Everybody has a price. Just as goods have values that fluctuate with supply and demand, the exact same is true for services and labor. The less desirable a job is, the more money it's likely to pay. For example, the average American garbageman makes around $41,000 a year, not including benefits. However, if that job requires you to risk life and limb, that salary can go up rather quickly. US firemen make a median $51,000 a year, working 2 to 3 24-hour shifts a week. Some experienced coal miners make over $125,000 a year, and saturation divers make $1,400 every single day of their dive. If you're willing to put yourself at risk and develop the skills, you too can be handsomely compensated for your work. However, having a risky job is far from a guarantee that you'll be well paid. In fact, one of the most dangerous jobs in the world pays a strikingly average salary. That career is, of course, the military. Across the globe, millions of soldiers from nearly every country put themselves in harm's way to protect the interests and people of their country. That being said, not all military jobs are made equal, although we'll not attempt to say that any job is more honorable than any other. There are some that are unquestionably more dangerous. Today we're going to take a look at some of the most dangerous jobs in military history. From walking bombs to the blunt force weapons of nations, soldiers have dedicated and sometimes given their lives to protect what they hold dear. During World War II, advances in technology changed nearly every aspect of how we wage war. From the ship and plane detecting radar equipment and heavy-duty aircraft carriers to penicillin, many different technologies shaped the battlefield. Few of these technologies had as much impact as the radio. Although the first ever radio signals had been sent in 1906, with the technology reaching mass adoption by the 1920s, this new technology had a far-reaching impact beyond the world of entertainment. By World War II, radio was seen as an essential way to communicate quickly to all troops spread across the globe. For America, the US Army Signal Corps was in charge of making sure messages were sent and received anywhere they needed to go. While some of these operators were stationed at military command far away from the fighting, others were on the front lines making sure the troops had all of the most up-to-date information that they needed in order to carry out their mission. On top of all of the other gear a soldier needs out on the front line, these members of the Signal Corps had to lug around a mobile radio. Now, it's easy to forget in an age where the devices in our pockets are more powerful than the computers that landed men on the moon, that communications devices have not always been miniaturized. Though a business executive's cell phone from the 1980s might be a bear moth compared to our modern devices, it is absolutely dwarfed by the SCR 300, also known as the walkie-talkie. Made by Motorola, this 35-pound machine was strapped to the soldier's back and allowed the commanding officer to quickly communicate with other units in military command. This sort of instant communication was invaluable in many different theaters of the war, but was particularly helpful during the chaotic and deadly hours of the D-Day invasion. Operation Overlord saw 150,000 troops from the US, UK, and Canada storm the beaches at Normandy as the first step to recapturing continental Europe from the Nazis. With so many troops on the field, instant communication was crucial to the Allied victory. This is also why the job was so dangerous. The walkie-talkie was not exactly a subtle device, with large antenna protruding from the top and looking significantly different than the backpacks of other soldiers with its rectangular frame. Anyone lugging it around was going to attract attention. As soon as they were spotted by enemy combatants, you can be absolutely sure they would top of the list as a priority target. Enemy soldiers knew all too well the effect that consistent and reliable communication can have on a battle. If the radio technician was killed, then that line of communication was cut. Although advances in technology allowed the components to be smaller by the outset of the Vietnam War, there was still a new set of dangers for these soldiers to contend with. In the jungles of Vietnam, there was rarely a well-defined front line. The Viet Cong forces used guerrilla warfare to slowly break down the American forces and made victories harder to come by. One of the key tactics of guerrilla warfare is ambushing the enemy. In that situation, the radio operator was one of the first targets, so that the startled troops wouldn't be able to call in reinforcements or even report troop locations. Today, advances in miniaturization have absolutely minimized this risk. Although mobile radio operators might still be high-value targets in a conflict, the smaller equipment makes them much less conspicuous and, thankfully, much safer. In the military, few mantras are quite as oft repeated as "I will leave no one behind" on the battlefield. In the fog of war, this can be a difficult promise to keep. However, the Air Force Special Operation Command's Pararescuemen, known colloquially as the PJs, have the difficult job of airlifting those in need from practically any situation. Their goals are usually simple: extract the target and get them to safety. However, that is much easier said than done. Tending to the wounded is a difficult task in any circumstance, but the pararescuemen have to be ready to get injured comrades out of any situation and back to their families, no matter what the obstacles or resistance that may impede their goal. Specializing in everything from search and rescue to emergency medical procedures, the pararescuemen are among the most highly trained soldiers in all of the armed forces. Training with the US Army Airborne for parachuting skills, with the Navy to become combat divers, and a 22-week paramedic course, the pararescuemen need to be sure they're ready for any environment that soldiers might find themselves in. As an example of heights of valor a pararescueman has achieved, take the life and career of Chief Master Sergeant Dwayne Hackney. In his less than 4 years serving in Vietnam, he flew over 200 missions, all of which he volunteered for. He was shot in the leg on his very first mission, and instead of going to a medic, he had his friend pull the bullet out so that he wouldn't have to waste any time on recovery and could go right back out on another mission. On February the 6th, 1967, Hackney would face the toughest test of his life. After failing to find a downed pilot near the Mugia Pass in a multi-hour search, he and his team quickly rushed back out after the pilot re-established communication. The lone pilot was located and pulled into the helicopter for an extraction back to base, but an explosion rattled the aircraft. The helicopter had been hit by an artillery shell and was moments from destruction. Putting his own parachute on the wounded pilot and getting him out of the helicopter, he grabbed the secondary chute. He didn't even have time to put it on when the helicopter exploded. Sergeant Hackney plummeted over 80 feet onto a rocky ledge. Despite suffering many injuries, he managed to make it back safely, avoiding capture. Tragically, he was the only member of the mission to survive, with his 4 crew members and the pilot being lost in the disaster. Sergeant Hackney is the most decorated airman in history, with an Air Force Cross, Silver Star, 2 Purple Hearts, 18 Air Medals, and numerous other honors. The motto of the Pararescue is, "The others may live." And Sergeant Hackney, as well as the thousands of other honorable veterans who have served in this role, as well as similar roles in armed forces across the globe, constantly put the lives of others before their own. Flamethrower troopers take our most base instincts and turn them into frightfully effective tools of war. Even the earliest humans knew that fire was both a tool and a weapon. On an already chaotic battlefield, a torrent of flame can send a soldier absolutely running. If they brave the onslaught, they risk being enveloped by the smoldering inferno. Although the technology has evolved over the decades, the basic setup is the same. A flamethrower is divided into 2 parts. Mounted on the back of the trooper are the fuel tanks, which store several components that combine in a deadly conflagration. The first of these is a flammable substance, usually petroleum-based, combined with some sort of thickener to keep the flames concentrated. The most infamous of these is napalm, which was used heavily in the Vietnam War, both in flamethrowers and dropped from planes. The second tank has a pressurized substance such as nitrogen as a propellant. This is needed to push the flammable liquid out and onto the target. The second half of the flamethrower is the gun. Attached to the tank with a hose, this ignites the liquid and helps direct the flame to whatever the trooper plans to incinerate. In World War I, heavily armored troops would fight across no man's land and into enemy trenches. While there, a flamethrower troop could clear an entire area in just a few minutes. The tactics were much the same in World War II, although heavy armor was replaced with an accompanying squad of support troops. Flamethrowers would be deployed in bunkers and other tight quarters to discourage resistance from enemy soldiers. So, with all of this equipment, armor, and support, what really made this job so dangerous? Well, with tanks of petroleum and propellant strapped to their back, one stray bullet could cause an entire apparatus to explode. Being the first man in the trench or bunker is a compromising position for any soldier. The flamethrower trooper, dropped into that same situation, also has a bomb attached to their back. Also, like the mobile radio operators we mentioned earlier, they were not exactly subtle. All eyes would turn toward them as soon as they let loose their inferno, and they would become a priority target. All of this adds up to a soldier with the most volatile weapon entering the most dangerous situation and being the most obvious target. It's not a good time. In the modern day, you're very unlikely to see any soldier wielding a flamethrower. Other anti-personnel weapons and deterrents such as flashbangs, smoke grenades, and even sonic weapons are more effective at clearing a room without the danger of having a bomb strapped to their back or running the risk of starting a fire that can spread far beyond its intended target. I'm sure these soldiers of today are certainly not lamenting the decline of this treacherous job. Improvised explosive devices, better known as IEDs, injured or killed over 350,000 civilians in the last decade. In Afghanistan alone, over 5,000 troop casualties are attributed to them. IEDs and unexploded ordnance are among the most deadly of the perils that both troops and civilians have to contend with. So, what happens when a soldier in Iraq finds an IED, or a little boy in Vietnam discovers an active landmine? Well, they call in the explosive ordnance disposal technicians. Unlike you may have seen in the movies, just snipping the red wire is not a guarantee that an explosive device is no longer a threat. Their job is to make sure these potentially dangerous weapons are rendered inert. Unlike many of the other jobs in this video, you can find these professionals in nearly every standing military in the world. Also, there are many civilian police forces that also train for the same purpose. Although America's conflict in Vietnam ended half a century ago, any explosive devices that are still left in the ground still have enormous potential to do harm. Over 40,000 civilians have been killed by them in the ensuing decades. You can find military, police, and civilian units alike trained to deal with these instruments of death and make their country just a bit safer. However, the country worst affected by this tragedy is Cambodia. The 20th century was full of bloodshed and war for the people of Cambodia, moving from French colonial rule to Japanese occupation in World War I, then getting caught up in the war with their neighbor Vietnam. The decades were harsh for the country, but unfortunately, the worst was yet to come. The sadistic dictator Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge only ruled the country's government for 4 years, from 1975 to 1979. But in that time, they killed 2 million of their own people. Between the decades of a brutal regime and the ensuing civil war, tens of millions of landmines were put in the ground across large swaths of the country and along its borders. Because of this, there are many areas of the country that are so littered with unexploded landmines that all but trained personnel are completely barred from entry. It's believed that there could still be up to 10 million active landmines still underground, waiting for an innocent victim to deliver its payload to. While not exactly a military organization, the Cambodia Mine Action Center, CMAC, is a government-affiliated organization that works to remove ordnance. No matter if it is a landmine near a school or underwater ordnance near a shipwreck, the valiant people of the CMAC work hard to disarm them and make the area safe. As you might imagine, working with explosives is treacherous at the best of times. When these devices have been exposed to half a century of decay, many of them are primed to blow at the slightest inclination. While they have already cleared countless devices, it will be a long time before it is safe to wander through the country off the beaten path. For the American military, the United States Navy Explosive Ordnance Disposal, EOD, is the preeminent force to render dangerous ordnances safe. They are trained to dispose of everything from the aforementioned IEDs and landmines to chemical and even nuclear weapons. With the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan, they were called on countless times to make sure that these instruments of death did not complete their intended task of mayhem. They often work in conjunction with other military and civilian forces such as the Secret Service, FBI, or local police forces when particularly dangerous situations arise. One paramilitary force that probably should have enlisted the EOD's help and advice is the Los Angeles Police Department Bomb Squad. Despite being one of the largest and best-funded police forces in the country, they demonstrated just how dangerous these devices can be when they're not designed with warfare in mind. In July 2021, LAPD raided an illicit fireworks distributor. On the property, they found copious amounts of homemade explosives. Although these were not designed to hurt anyone, it doesn't mean that the huge explosive power wasn't dangerous. Not wanting to transport large amounts of explosive material on the freeway during rush hour, they made the decision to explode the ordnance there using their vehicle with a containment unit designed specifically for this purpose. They cleared a 300-foot radius from the truck and informed neighbors of the impending explosion. As soon as it went off, they realized something was catastrophically wrong. The containment unit was gone, as was much of the truck. Windows shattered across the block and beyond, and car alarms went off in every direction. At least 17 people suffered injuries from the blast. The 500-pound containment lid was found 3 blocks down the road. The LAPD had dramatically underestimated the amount of ordnance they were exploding and caused the entire device to fail. This is what happened when attempted professionals attempted to disarm fireworks that had no other purpose than some entertaining explosions. Now substitute that with a device made by a maniac hoping to harm as many people as possible. That is what the EOD seeks constantly to eliminate. These men and women, along with thousands of others in militaries across the globe, have saved countless lives and will continue to do so, despite those who might try to cause mayhem and destruction. Although these roles are incredibly dangerous, if you calculate the most dangerous job by number of casualties alone, no other group would come close to infantry. From the ancient battlefields of Greece and Rome to the medieval crusades, the Somme and the Ukrainian countryside, the infantry has been a part of nearly every battle across all of human history. In fact, nearly all military units in ancient times were considered infantry until technology advanced to allow chariot riders and horse-mounted cavalry. Even then, they would have been just a small part of a much larger force that was still predominantly infantry-based. At its most basic, infantry just means foot soldiers. The infantry is the first line of defense, or the point of the spear in nearly every conflict. They are the blunt force weapon thrown against an enemy line until it crumbles and breaks. Tactics, weaponry, and technology have changed infantry troops over the last several millennia, but their role has sort of been the same. They're an overwhelming force of war used to take targets by brute force, and often with tragically high casualty rates. The most famous infantry in antiquity is likely the feared Spartan warrior. Highly trained and heavily armored, they were the special forces of the ancient world, but they only fought on foot. Although the Battle of Thermopylae is unquestionably the most famous of their exploits, it is exemplary of the dedication and vigor that all their soldiers were expected to demonstrate at all times. It is also exemplary of the danger they faced, as all the soldiers in the conflict perished. Although the idea that they wished to die in battle is a popular myth, they in fact thought fighting to live was more noble than wanting to die. They'd much rather face death than suffer defeat. Death in battle was a valorous end, as long as the soldiers were fighting for their lives and not on a suicide mission. The saying of mothers to their soldiers was to come home bearing their shields or having their bodies carried on them. If a soldier came home alive after a lost battle, they would be the subject of shame and ridicule. By the 1st century CE, the Roman legionaries were the height of infantry prowess. However, this was also fraught with danger. The Punic Wars fought between Rome and Carthage between 256 and 145 BCE saw over 1.5 million deaths and countless more casualties. Nearly all the military casualties were in the infantry. 2 millennia of progress saw infantry units move from heavily armored units with swords and shields to modern soldiers wielding firearms. However, it did not become less deadly. World War I saw entire divisions of infantry nearly wiped out in charges across no man's land. World War II didn't fare much better. Of the 1.1 million American casualties of World War II, 600,000 of them were in the infantry. If those numbers were consistent across the Allied powers, it could mean that over 10 million Soviet infantry soldiers were killed or wounded in the conflict. Although exact numbers are extremely spotty, you can be sure that the infantry wasn't far away.